Alrighty, there we go. So thank you all so much for coming to our first after hours event in quite a while, and a massive thank you to our host, David de la Fuente, for coming in and kicking off the whole new year of after hours animation. Some of you may be familiar with David's work. Tonight's talk is called Field Trip. And yeah, I'm going to read a little bit about our host and then hand it over to him. So David de la Fuente is an animation artist with interest in the moving image, semiotics, and graphic design. His work has explored themes of queerness, aesthetic experiences, and romanticism. His films have shown in the Annecy International Animation Film Festival, Slamdance Film Festival, Melbourne Queer Film Festival, Ottawa International Animation Festival, and others. He earned his Bachelor of Fine Arts from the Rhode Island School of Design, and currently David is based in New York, where he continues his process of experimental storytelling. And a big thank you tonight because David is tuning in from France, so he's quite late there. So I'm really appreciate you taking the time to come out and share with us all.
Thank you. Hi. Hello, everyone. Yeah, thank you for having me, and thank you for coming to this event. And thank you, McKenna, for inviting me to After Hours. I'm so grateful to be here and to be able to participate in this event series and to share my thoughts on animation and the process that happens while making it. So yeah, I'm an independent animator with a focus on short films and experimental storytelling. And over the past years, I've been developing and working in this creative process that I'm about to share with you all in a moment. So should I share my screen now?
Go ahead.
Okay, great. Share. Okay, cool. Is this being broadcast? Is this live?
Ooh. Yes, it's live. It's not full screen yet, but
it's not. Oh yeah. Okay. How about now?
Perfect.
Okay, great. There you go. So perhaps before we jump in, to clarify, this talk is not a how-to guide on making short films or work in general, or I'm not here to really tell anyone how they should be making work. I'm sure whatever process you have for yourself is totally fine. Whatever works for you is for you. My goal for this talk is to simply share my notes on what I've learned and developed over the years, and within this process, and to maybe also give some inspiration, to give back some of the inspiration that I've gathered. I think the hardest part in any process is that moment when self-doubt kicks in and you feel a little alone, and you start to think that maybe what you're working on isn't worth it, or maybe you're unsure where to go with yourself. And I've certainly been there before, and I'll continue to arrive at that point. So I've designed this talk to be a little creative boost to help get past that point. So with that being said, let's get into it. So this talk should be about 45 to 50 minutes long, roughly. And I framed it around my time working on my latest short film compositions for understanding relationships and the process it took to make that film. And cut in between that, I'll also share some notes on my overall creative process and how I like to source inspiration and organize my thoughts. So to begin, I think we have to start at the most important aspect of animation, which is time. Time is a vital aspect to the medium, time and motion. And I think when I started as an animation student, that's when my relationship with time sort of began, and trying to really thinking about time, and in this practice trying to capture it and imitate it. And I remember being really frustrated as a student because I couldn't really grasp the way time frames itself around, animation frames itself around time. But with time I got better at it. And time for myself is a really important theme in my work. Within my films, I'm always addressing time and placing it at the center of my dialogue. And I think I can view each of my films as a way of me grappling with time in different ways. Either in forms of prayer to ask for healing, for protection, or for solace, and or for revelation. Time is the overarching theme that like binds it all together. I keep a sketchbook on me at all times. It's the first thing I pack when I'm traveling somewhere, and I try to make sure it's always like in my tote bag or like my little crossbody bag for like when I'm heading to a cafe or like to a bar or park or museum, like places to be. And I like buying the little pocket-sized sketchbooks so that they're like easy to travel with. And my sketchbooks have sort of become documents of what I work on, and I try to document that experience of whatever projects that I'm working on as well as I can. I'll write down like little footnotes on the edges of pages to like capture whatever the feelings I'm having or what I'm dealing with in between ideas. And over the years, my sketchbooks have become like a heavy mixture of like written thoughts and drawings. Sometimes mostly just like writing. It's more of like a diary or a journal. And so because of that, they're like really private to me. So like I'm being very vulnerable right now with sharing some of my pages right now. But in the spirit of the talk and like inviting you guys into my process, I figured I had to share like a little bit. But still I had to make some redactions because I'm not ready to be that vulnerable. But when I'm having trouble with something or trying to figure something out, I found that just like writing and getting those issues objectively formed on paper can help sort of like work through it. Um, my creative process at its core is a therapeutic process. My work is a space for me to be honest and authentic with myself. If I can't be myself or honest with myself within my own studio, then like, what's the point? And I find the act of animating to be really meditative. Not all the time. Sometimes it's like the most painful thing, and I'll be sitting at my desk working, and like after 3 minutes, I would rather be doing like anything else, and then I'll like stop. But when I'm able to like focus and really enjoy, the practice of animating, it can be a really meditative sort of moment. And I think that's what really kept me going as an animator, was finding out like years later that this act can also be a source of healing. And I find it really helpful to go through old sketchbooks and like visit my past self and see how I was trying to solve problems or my ideas or like, the young ambition I had for projects. Or simply to remember how I was experiencing something, it forms like a little gesture of like reassurance to see myself like 5 years ago, either like asking a question I figured out now, or like my past self echoing the same thoughts I'm having now. I'll take a sip of water. Okay. Um, with that being said, there is a statement attached to my work, which is nothing is ever actually finished because anything could be brought back at like any time. Compositions for understanding relationships was originally a project I started in school as a student. In my third year at school, I developed a process of repetition and minimalism. I was inspired by the abstract expressionist painters, and I really wanted to bring their like dramatic and compelling compositions into animation. So I like made a series of videos of like dark shapes on like dark backgrounds, and I moved them slowly and you could barely see what you were looking at. And I was really invested in that. I was really invested in the idea of the act of watching and like being able to see and unsee something and like developing a relationship with the moving image. And it was also a process of like doing the same thing over and over again with like slightly different changes added in to bring new results. So again, I'm being like very vulnerable with you, like sharing my student work, which like I have like buried into the dark corners of my hard drive, but just to show you like sort of the dramatic contrasts between school years. At the time, I wasn't really sure why I felt so determined to be in this process, to be like making this type of work. But looking back, it's made so much more sense as to like why it took such a dramatic shift. I needed that space to be me. I needed that feeling of freedom and space to be honest and like not hold anything back. And the ambition for this process and the work that it produced was a demand from myself to be present within my own work. I needed it for me. Up until that point, I had been doing nothing but making work for other people, because that's what you do as a student, you know, from high school to college. The art student's portfolio is not built around developing a voice, but really just showing how well can you master, you know, foundational techniques. You know, are you able to understand the principles and rules of being a traditional artist? And I'll try like not to get into a debate of like, is this a good way of shaping young artists? But that was my experience. And for years, my work and my perspective of making work was this, you know, importance of technique and making work designed for the classroom. So when I started my third year and I was finally given that freedom to like make work for myself and not based around the rules of an assignment, I didn't really care that much about like what my classmates would think of my work. And I like didn't really care about making work that like wasn't like technically impressive, because I had already done that, you know, like I did that for like 8 years, and I really wanted to start over and like forget everything I had learned up until that point and like rebuild my, you know, sense of creative self. And I think my notes, oh, what happened?
Everything looks all good on our end.
Everything's great. Okay.
Yes.
Um, I think my, oh, well, yeah. I was trying to think of like if I were, you know, I don't know who's in the audience, if there's any students, but my note to students would be like, don't be so concerned about making work to like impress your classmates or like your professor or whatever. Like after a certain point, you know, you should start like making work for yourself. And like being a student and being in a classroom and like having critiques is like the best time to experiment and to try something new, because you're like never really going to have that same level of freedom and like the chance to share it with like so many people. So like take advantage of that, you know, take risks. Don't worry about if someone like doesn't understand it or doesn't like it, because you know what matters is like if you like it, you know, like work, and if you find it worth working towards. That was like my little like note to past self. um
Thank you for sharing that too. I think that's so important. Sorry to jump in while you're taking a sip,
No,
but
no, please, you know. So I've never don't really like talk for this long, so like my throat's like, shut it up. But yeah, so back to this time, when after being in this process for 2 semesters, by the end of that year, my work was finalized in 2 thesis projects, one of which would become my first short film called You, and the other was like a performance-based project called Compositions for Understanding Relationships. And when I was working on the original version of Compositions, I didn't actually get to spend that much time um, working on it, because I was spending all my time animating You. The 2 projects were made like at the same time, because there are 2 final projects for 2 different classes. So when I shared compositions with my class, I didn't really feel that complete with it, because there was so much more I wanted to do. And I remember like the critique notes that I got really made me want to return to the project at some time to like finish it and like improve the concept. And the next year was my senior thesis year, and I didn't want to focus on compositions for that entire year. I wanted to do something new. So I like placed compositions in the background, but like knowing years later that I would like return to this. So that brings me to notes on creative energy. There's this magical idea of creativity that it exists as this like energetic spark that like moves around us. It's a very like Rick Rubin-esque sort of philosophy that this energy connects us and we all grab from the same pool of energy, and we all like share the same wavelength and exist in like a sort of like creative ecosystem together, you know, like we rely on each other to make and share work and to inspire and motivate each other and to like move forward together. And you know, we share ideas and perspectives and feelings and anxieties and similarities, and we build collectives and communities and spaces for when we don't feel seen. And through the lens of art history, like these are how movements and trends are formed. And if we were to like zoom out right now, we're certainly participating in that. And like to like zoom back in, we're certainly within a really interesting and like scary moment in time with animation, especially with like everything going on with like the strikes and Hollywood and like the sort of like daunting complexity of AI. And so sometimes it like I find it helpful to like remember to like sort of like zoom out every now and then and like look objectively through the lens of like movements. I really like the concept of like zooming out. It's like my favorite form of meditation, to like zoom out as far as possible, like in the film Power of 10 by the Eames studio, and to get that perspective that this isn't just about me, and like I'm not here to exist just as an individual, that there are other people here and like that share the same ideas and feelings as me. Which is why I find events like this, like After Hours or like Multidult or Hellevision or Soft Screen or Glass or whatever, to be extremely important and valuable, because it brings the community together. It makes this more than just about ourselves. It becomes a space for ideas and sharing work and keeping this medium alive, and supporting each other. And that is a form of creative energy, and I think it's really important and special to like keep alive. I think about the history of this medium, and I don't think animators ever had this much of an ability to communicate and share their craft. Like that was something that happened behind studio doors in spaces that were like really kept and guarded. And it wasn't something that was sold, or it was something that was sold and not given. And I think now this medium is, I think, the most open and transparent it's ever been. And yet it still remains a mystery to like a lot of people, which I find interesting. Circling back to this idea of creative energy, we all borrow ideas from each other, either voluntarily or involuntarily. When you look at something or experience something, it can be a moment for inspiration, and to absorb and learn something from another person or object, regardless if you like the work or not. When I go to a museum or a screening or a gallery, there's an offering for contemplation. And if I share my time with something and I sit there with it long enough, I try to absorb whatever like energy it's giving me. And then when I get back to my studio, or like when I start a new project, I try to like release that energy back into whatever I'm making. Sip water. um, I really enjoy Walter Benjamin's idea of the aura within aesthetic theory. His idea of the aura essentially is that art possesses a uniqueness in time and space. Something that is felt in the presence of art, a sort of like magical phenomenon found in spaces wherever the original object may be, like a museum or a gallery. And when we're in the presence of these pieces, we experience this aura, like that is what we feel when we look at art. And I think it's a really important aspect of the object relationship. Benjamin, in his essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, talks about, due to mass production, art has begun to lose its aura. The aura can't be duplicated or copied, and film, by that extension of copying, denies the medium its aura. And this isn't necessarily like a bad thing. Like Benjamin celebrates this loss of aura. He thought that film was really interesting in that it changed the dynamic of art and politics. I won't go too much into Benjamin's essay, but if you want to check it out, like I do recommend it. It's like definitely not like an easy read, but it definitely presents like some like interesting views on film. But my point here is like the concept of the aura. And when I begin research on a project, the first thing I seek out are places to connect and to be in the presence of art that inspires me, to feel that aura. When I was a student, I would like go to my school's museum and like sit and like meditate with Rothko's work, because it like presented something to me that I just found incredibly compelling, and it offered a space for contemplation. And I think it's important to find this space and to be in it and to capture the way that art makes you feel, to get outside the studio and to a location for the purpose of influence, wherever that may be for you. It doesn't have to be a museum, it doesn't have to be paintings. Similar to Benjamin's reaction to mechanical reproduction, the artist and designer William Morris also had a strong reaction against mass production seen in the first industrial revolution. He felt that beauty found from craftsmanship was being lost in machine-made objects, and that decorative arts was becoming ugly. He wanted to bring beauty back into the world. It was his own protest against industrial capitalism. And he was really inspired by the aesthetics of the medieval period, a mixture of fantasy and ritual that produced objects of devotion. And Morris, along with his friends, would like dress up in like armored suits and like model for drawings, and they found themselves linked by their similar interest and bounced ideas off of each other. Morris would design a house along with his friend Philip Webb called the Red House, and it was a collaboration in their interest in medieval appreciation. And after the house was built, Morris would like later invite his other friends to come and visit and like help with the interiors, having friends paint murals, design furniture, design textiles, and it forms like a little like creative collective. And then this would later become like the arts and craft movement, which was a decorative art revival period within Europe and North America. And then like that would later give influence to like the Art Nouveau style, which I all find very interesting. This idea of like the collective creative energy and how it can like, influence these moments. I think my main goal, which has sort of taken shape from this summer, is the belief that like if you work at something long enough and if you invest enough hours, not in a singular project, but like within a process, you can elevate taste and perhaps raise the cultural level of an art form, like develop an understanding or appreciation for something new or different. Yeah. So I'm going to take a notice of the water. Okay, good stuff. After I finished school and I moved to New York, I started working on my third film called Guidance, which focused on these two wrestlers that were like caught in a dance with each other. And it was my first time making work outside of the classroom, without the help from classmates or professors guiding me within my process. And the film essentially served as a question as to like whether I was even capable of like making films anymore, or like continuing this process outside of the classroom. And the answer to that, well, the answer essentially was like, if I could complete the film, like that was the answer to the question. But the answer really was balance, balancing life, working full-time as an animator, working on my films, and still being outside, the studio and like enjoying life. In 2019, I went to the Glass Animation Festival in California because my film Guidance was screening there. And I was real excited to finally go. I mean, Glass as an organization and a festival has always meant a lot to me. And there aren't a lot of animation festivals in America, and there's definitely like a lack of screening opportunities. So when something like Glass or Sweaty Eyeballs or Block Party happens, it's really special to have. Again, going back to the idea of like creative energy and communities, like that's what occurs at these spaces. And my experience at the festival that year was really inspiring. And it was a weekend of just like spending time with other animators and like meeting new people or meeting up with like former classmates that I hadn't seen in a while, and meeting directors whose like work I studied like in school or like work I was introduced to in school, and like having my film play as like the same program as my animation professor and like having a Q&A with him, like it was like a really special, experience to have. And my takeaway from that weekend really involved how I wanted to like make work. Um, so the flip side to that is that as an introvert, like film festivals are really exhausting. Like I am constantly anxious and like literally forgetting how to like engage in conversation. And despite these festivals designed around sitting in silence in a dark theater for hours, there's like a lot of socializing and like networking and just like being a person in public, which for myself is tiring. So while I always recommend going and participating in one to a festival, I like have to remind myself like how much energy it requires because like it's a lot, but it's worth it. Also, like little did I know, like this would be like the last time Glass would have an in-person festival because the next year was 2020, and yeah, like shut down after that. And then since then, it's like been virtual, which is a shame, but hopefully next year it comes back. Um, so, meanwhile, being in California for the first time, I was really excited to like go on a hike. Like being from New York City, you don't get that obviously. And like as someone who grew up in South Florida, you absolutely do not get that. So literally every time I go to California, I'm like always like so down to like go on a hike, aka like walking up a trail. Um, but anyway, like so one day, me and my friend went hiking up Griffith in LA. And while we were hiking, I just felt so like in awe of the landscape around me, like being surrounded by these mountains and, the nature. And not that Griffith is like the most like sublime experience, but like this being my first time in this experience in this environment and experience, like it really did move me. And there was a moment when we were walking up the trail, I was like looking around at the mountains and it just like took me outside of myself and like into contemplation. And I had this idea in that moment that I needed to be making work like at this level. Like I need to be making something as great like as the mountains around me. Um, for context though, like this lasted for like a second and then I went back to talking about like the Kardashians or whatever with my friend. Like this entire hike wasn't some like soulful self-realizing experience. It was actually like incredibly stupid, and we walked for like 30 minutes and then it started to rain and then we left. But like for a moment, for a second, I was able to like get this idea of like how I wanted my process to grow and evolve. um so, anyways, and then as I was reflecting on the plane ride back to New York and like after the festival and like after, spending time in California, I thought about what I wanted to do next and I felt really inspired. Like I wanted to do something bigger and to take my level of animation to like the next level. Essentially to feel like I am giving my all and trying to, you know, do my best at something. Like to feel like I'm making work at the top of that mountain. And like that sort of became a goal in my process. Um, so months later, after the festival, the Glass team announced their next grant cycle, which awarded to independent animators for the next project. And when I got that email, I knew it was finally time for like me to like return to compositions. And I immediately got started working on my proposal. And I'll say like even like the grant itself was great to have and it really did help the completion of the project, but just like the process of applying to the grant and like I think was more rewarding than the grant itself, like no shade. And it was like super helpful for the film, like yes, like funding is essential and like great to have, but also like having something to motivate and push yourself towards accomplishing I think is like just as beneficial, at least for myself. Like it gave me a deadline to sort of like get my shit together about like what I wanted this project to be, and it like forced me to write and gather my ideas. Um, so as we've like already noted, the sketchbook is where my film process starts. From there, once an idea is formed or a direction appears for me to go in, I try to start to mold these ideas together like clay, and like taking different concepts and ideas I've had and like try like pull them together. Um, this phase of my process is what I call research and discovery. And it's essentially like the pre-production phase. It's like where I build the outline sketch for the film, the framework. And then after that, I have what I like to call airplane mode, aka like when I'm locked into animating and like doing production. And then eventually the post-production phase, where I like to call the cutting room, where I start to like edit, and like no matter how lovely an animation sequence might be, like everything is up for a debate in this phase. Like if it's not serving the film, like, or it loses its context, like I will cut it out. um, Meanwhile, for compositions, the work was in a sense like already half done since I had started it as a student. But in the second attempt, I wanted to sort of like expand the concept and do more research to help clarify what the film should be. So this is sort of like a map I remember doing, like the books I read and the albums I listened to and some of the films I remember watching. I don't have the hard drive to keep the film on with me at the moment. Um, on that hard drive, I do have like the full like pre-production list of like resources and materials I used for research. But since I don't have that, I like tried my best to like remember some of the things I used for research. And in doing this research, like reading books and like listening to albums and like watching films and like going to museums, they're all ways for me to help verbalize my ideas. Usually, at the beginning of a project, I like at the beginning of a project, I have an idea or like many ideas of what I wanted to do, but I struggle with communicating it either with like people or like just with myself when I'm trying to figure out like what to do. And doing this research and finding work that speaks to the same interests of what I'm trying to explore really helps me gain clarity. I think the most rewarding part of this process, of this phase of the process, is when I'll like write down questions I have about a topic or like a concept that I'm exploring, or questions like about myself. And then I'll like go out and I'll like read a book or like I'll watch a film and like I'll find the answers there. Like sometimes the answer is like literally written out because like we all influence each other, and the chances of the chances are probably someone has probably already arrived at this question. I'll touch on this idea later on, but yeah. In addition to that, this phase is also when I establish like the textures, colors, and like fonts and like materials for the film. I like to design the film at this stage to like help give it shape. It's like my version of world building. It gives me clarity of like what feels like it belongs to the film spirit and like what doesn't. Sort of like, like animating through like graphic design, I guess. Um, and for compositions, I wanted very clearly to break up the production process into stages and use that time to only focus on things relevant to that stage. Like stage one was research, stage two was design, etc. When I was working on guidance, I was sort of like doing everything at once. Like I was animating and I was designing and I was like editing and I was doing like sound design and research. And it got like very confusing. And I was like constantly changing my mind on the direction for the film. So for compositions, I wanted to like very clearly break down the process into phases and develop like a clear vision and understanding for the film at the beginning, and like try to like not overwhelm myself. I also like to establish rules and like to help build the framework for the film. Um, I to it helps me establish what I'm allowed to do and like what I can't do, and it helps like limit my focus and like create like a ceiling. So these were some of the rules I remember making for compositions. I don't have the hard drive with like the actual like full list of rules that I came up with, but this is what I remember of some of them. And like some of them were like very silly, like no liquids near paper, because like one day I was like animating and had a glass of water on my desk and I almost spilled it over a stack of papers. So obviously after that incident, I created the rule, no liquids on near paper. But I think the most important rule was the no absolute white or black values. Texture is a really important part of my filmmaking process. And for compositions, I really wanted the film to feel like paper. I was really in love with how paper, when captured with a down shooter, the color of the white paper was always different. You know, sometimes it was blue, sometimes it was purple, sometimes orange, sometimes green. You know, it was never just white. So the rule, like no absolute whites or black values, was formed. And paper was the ultimate source of inspiration for this film. Like, obviously, it was connected back to the fact that the film was existed on paper, like physically, but there was also like a delicacy to it. You know, like the paper that it was made on was like cheap recycled paper, so it was thin and like vulnerable, but the grain was like coarse. It was like rough and sharp. So I really wanted the film to like carry that spirit. If that makes any sense. Part of my process is I build a very large mood board and reference library. Again, in the same way that I'll like read like a lot of books that are relevant to my ideas, the reference library is used to help verbalize my concepts and like give it shape. If I see a piece of work that either aesthetically or conceptually or thematically ties back directly to like what I'm doing, you know, like I'm gonna put that in the reference folder, you know, like to go back to the idea of creative energy, you know, like, and this like universal wavelength that connects all of us, you know, like there are thousands of years of art history, you know, like why shouldn't I use that to my advantage? You know, like someone must have arrived at something similar to what I'm doing, you know, like I don't believe anything is made like in a vacuum. Everything exists amongst each other and like influences one another. And there's so much you can learn and absorb from like other people, you know, like animation doesn't have to be this like exact individual act of creation. Um, I remember having a conversation with a friend of mine who studied architecture, and we were discussing the different processes we had in school, like the differences of being an animation student versus an architecture student. And like one of the most interesting contrasts for me was in her critiques, she had to be able to defend and produce a reason for like every element of her design. You know, like every tree that was placed, every corner or like line had to come with a reason if she was asked. You know, like there wasn't really any room for, well, I just thought it looked nice. You know, like it had to come from a process of reason. And so that's how I started to view making references in my work. Like if I decide to actually bring a reference into the film directly, it needs to be as integral and informative to the whole of the piece, like an architectural composition. Um, you know, what is it adding to the piece overall by being there? You know, what is it saying? How does it enhance the structure, the experience? You know, does it have a layered nuance to its context? I think reference making can become stale and boring when the connection doesn't lead you anywhere, or like ultimately doesn't like say anything about the context within the piece. Um, and it should also be said, like there's a difference between inspiration, reference, and imitation. And there's a time and place for all of them, and they can also all happen like at the same time. One of the references in composition is the video game The Legend of Zelda, the Ocarina of Time. And it was something that existed in the original edition of the project. I would play the Legend of Zelda on my computer and like feed it through a VJ software and like either with a remote control or with the computer keys, I would like distort the game's graphics and like turn it into like a distorted abstract version of itself. In its original form, the game was like an interactive element. Like people could like, take the controller and play the game, and like I would be like distorting it. And the game itself had like some personal memories attached to it. So when I returned to the project and I was translating it into a short film, I knew I wanted to include the Legend of Zelda sequence that I had done, like, sort of like in the original. But I wasn't really sure how it would like sort of fit overall. The first and last sequences I actually animated for the film were the Zelda sequences. Um, and as I started to animate them, it formed a really interesting dialogue between my past and present self. It brought back like a lot of memories of like playing the game and like, which was like back in college, and the moments that like sort of happened like around that time, and also bringing me back to memories of like when I first made this project. And as I was animating these sequences and focusing on this image of a figure, traveling through time, like journeying through the past and present to like save his world, I started to see more complex layers to this image. And it became a really compelling sequence to me. And the more time I spent with it, the more it like slowly started to like reveal itself, which I thought was really cool. um, Another huge inspiration for me while I was making this film was fashion design. Fashion and the creative process behind like collections like really fascinates me. I think the design process behind collections are like can be like really interesting. I saw a video recently that Margella released on YouTube called Swalk. I think it's pronounced. I think it stands for Sealed with a Loving Kiss, which essentially documents their entire creative process behind their recent collections. And it was a really cool and interesting insight into how they navigate their ideas and research and how they do their reference making. It's really interesting, and I really definitely recommend it to anyone. Sorry. I love reading and like hearing about fashion creative directors' creative process and how they're able to like pool their references together and through their pieces splice these references apart and like have it inform how these clothings and eventually the collection will take shape, all while adding their own voice into the design. Again, I think the Margella video does like a great way of like displaying this process. um, and the work of Ralph Simmons was a really big influence on this film. His use of text really caught my attention. It was really refreshing to see like how he was like able to like make his references and like to sort of see art and design made from a completely different process from my own, but like still find like similarities in like how I make my own work. I also really like how fashion can be used as a way of like making time visible, like how is an encapsulation of culture and time, and like how it sort of operates on a cyclical level, and its ability to self-reference and like be aware of its own existence. Side note also, like when I would sit and like punch the stacks of paper to prepare for animating, I would like watch an episode of Chef's Table, which I found like so cool and inspiring. Like I just loved how the chefs in that show were like able to like show you their like life story and like create a process, and how like they also perform research for the dishes that they make. And eventually how like it all comes together. It's just like so refreshing to see the process of like different art forms, how different art forms are like sort of made, but also how universal the creative process can be. So after like 6 months of animating the film, I was reviewing the sequences I had made. so far, and I was like really disappointed in the work. I wasn't being overly critical or like putting myself down. I just felt like the work wasn't saying anything to me. Like it lacked a direction or coherence. So I made the decision to just throw everything out and start over. Because again, like going back to the mountain, I needed my work to be like something as great as that, something at that level. And I don't think it's like a form of like perfectionism. My goal isn't to make something perfect, but rather knowing when something is good enough for me. Like, am I happy with this? And I don't think you have to like totally start over every time you get to a point in your process where you start to become unsure of yourself, or maybe you're like a bit unhappy with the work. Sometimes if I'm spending too much time on something and I'm like too close to it, I like lose the ability to determine if it's like good or not. So usually when I get to that point, it's just like I like to take a step back and like spend time and maybe spend a couple days doing something else, or like just to create some distance between me and the work so I can like refresh how I'm feeling. Um Ultimately with compositions, I needed to start over, like, and so I did. And in doing so, I like went right back to phase one and returned to doing research. And eventually I came across this film called Dior and I think I misspelled. No, okay. And it's a documentary about Raf Simmons' first collection as the new women's wear creative director at Dior. And what I love about this film is how it documents the creative process from Raf. And it's a really honest portrayal of that process, I think. Like he's really nervous about like starting his new job, and he like feels like really insecure about like the decisions he's making. And there's like a lot of pressure added into as well. Like he was like replacing Galliano, who was director for like 7 years, and he didn't really have a reputation as a women's wear director. And on top of that, I think he only had like maybe 8 weeks to produce this like first collection. But anyway, um I remember watching this film and having it make the connection to me that like regardless of position or like level of influence or scale, we're all experiencing the same obstacles in the creative process. We all doubt ourselves, find anxieties and insecurities, and share the belief that like maybe we don't know what we're doing. It doesn't matter if you're an animator working on a project with absolutely like no risk involved, or like the creative director of like $1 billion fashion house. The obstacles of the process are exactly the same. And as I was rebuilding my film, trying to figure out what wasn't working and like what needed to be brought in, I noticed it lacked a visible central structure. I hadn't yet figured out like what the synopsis of the film was, or like what I was really trying to say, which I think is like some like it's okay sometimes to like not have that figured out until later. Like sometimes, I don't really understand what that film is until like years after I finish making it, because like going back to the statement, like nothing is ever actually finished. But for compositions, I needed to understand how these compositions were relating to each other. And therefore, I needed to understand what this film was and what was at its core. So, again, back to the research phase, I returned to reading A Lover's Discourse by Roland Barthes. And I found a chapter that really stood out to me, which was the love letter. I think it's like one of the first chapters in the book. And I remember reading this chapter in Thompson Square Park on a park bench with like a cup of coffee and a bagel, and like feeling so overwhelmed with the page's text. Like it just like made total sense. Like I knew like from reading that, and in that moment, I knew exactly what I needed to do for the film. So when I returned to my desk, and over the next couple of weeks, it all started to like come together. And then after that, for the next 4 months, I remade the entire film. And well, sorry. um, while I don't like recommend locking yourself away for 4 months and doing nothing but animation, when something clicks and there's like nothing standing in your way anymore, you have to take advantage of that moment. You just have to go as fast as you can towards whatever goal is there. Like when it clicks, like that's the bang of the racing pistol, like so now just like go, like don't let anything stop you. This is the synopsis of the film, by the way. It's literally a page from A Lover's Discourse. There's two synopsises for the film. One of them, which like I'll send to like, a festival whatever, it's simply a love letter. And then the other version is this. Like this is like the full like extended version of what my film's about. um Meanwhile, like during that 4 month animation, like airplane mode, lockdown, like there was a phrase that kept returning to me when I was animating, which was like, these images are for us. And it became sort of like a mantra when I was animating. I felt like I was making this film for us. And the recipient of that statement changed a lot. Like sometimes it was just me, sometimes it was another person, or sometimes it was for people who like understood this language. The love letter needed a recipient. And when I start the film, I started with that line because that's who I'm addressing it to. It's for us and nobody else. The ones who get it, and the ones who don't. um, so I'm gonna take a sip of water again. Also, like getting towards like the end of this talk. But I am definitely the type of person that needs music to do like just about anything. I'm sure it's like super cliche to say like music is like a large source of is a large form of inspiration, but like it is. I can't work without music. And just as any other form of material in my research process, music is a large part of that as well. Like I love finding albums that encapsulate the same. Sorry. I like finding albums that sort of share the same ideas or themes that I'm exploring in my film. And I like hearing it being expressed in a different form. Again, it's like a different way of me trying to like articulate like my thoughts. Um, when I was a student, my animation professor asked us to make a map for our film to sort of help guide the structure. And the map could be anything. Like it could be like an actual field map or a storyboard or a drawing. It really was just like anything that would help guide you through the process of making the film. And my version of this map was a mixtape. I made a mix featuring songs that, sorry, I made a mixtape featuring songs that I felt channeled the energy of the film that I was aiming to make. And I curated them like in an order that followed like the narrative of like what I was hoping to achieve. Um, it made sense to me. And it helped guide me through making that film. It was my first time making a film, so I was like kind of like unsure how to go about it. And since then, I've sort of kept this part of the process as a tradition. And each of my films like have like a mixtape like storyboard that I usually make like before I start animating to help, guide me through. Um, I don't really like when people ask like what my hobbies are, or like I don't really like the word like hobby, but if I were to choose like what my hobby is, it would be like crafting playlists and mixtapes, like collecting sounds and songs and curating them like in an ideological way. Like it's like it really is like one of my favorite things to do. Um I also like organizing, so I think it's a form of that. But as animators, like we know the magic of a good playlist. It gives us that space to work for long hours and channel our creativity into the project. Um, there's that zone of creativity when like you're so connected to what you're doing that you like lose track of time. Um, and when I'm animating, I'm mostly listening to albums or mixtapes or that I've made or like a dope playlist, or I'm like researching new albums and artists that I feel are relevant to the work that I'm making. And the sounds that I choose for my films are like they are I try to like be as precise with them as I am with like the image references I'm making, like going back to the idea of like the architecture critique and how everything needed a reason for its context, like that's sort of how I try to like operate with the sound design. Maybe it's 7-1 or something, or maybe not. I don't know. Okay, I'm good. um, I made a decision that I wouldn't start working on the film's sound until after I finished animating. I wanted to see like the completed image and imagine what that image would sound like. So after animating, the entire film and putting together like a rough edit of the film, I went on this like search for the sound, and I went on to Bandcamp and like I went looking for work that like matched the spirit of the film. Um, Originally, like I did want to work with like a musician and like collaborate on an original sound for the film, but I was keeping myself like nailed to a timeline schedule that I had made. And since I started over, there just like wasn't any time to start like this whole collaboration journey. But in my research, in my music research, I came across the work of Tyler Barber and his album It_O, which is a beautifully like synth packed like ambient album, very reminiscent to the albums I was listening to like way back at the beginning of my research process. And one of the songs on the album, the song I think it's Tell Him 07 Crash Restart. It really struck out to me the most. And in a similar moment to me reading like A Lover's Discourse, I knew this song had to be used in the film. I felt like the title of the song really resonated with the spirit, being like a love letter and, expressing yourself to another person, and starting over. And the sound also really synced up well with the image I was making. And like I think in part it may seem like a lucky coincidence, which maybe it is, but that really is the point of my research process, is to go out into the world and like dig deep into like the libraries of information and like find the things that are relevant to the concepts that you're developing, like, and then like gather them all together and like find the synchronization. um Animation can be a very isolating and independent and like stubborn practice. So I find it healthy to like step out of that and like let other people in. Um, my friends and I are constantly sharing our work with each other and like offering feedback and ideas and things that we like and don't like. And we also hype each other up big time. I think they're in the chat room right now and they've been like texting me nonstop throughout this presentation. So like if you've heard my phone buzzing, that's them. Um, and we hype each other up because that's like, what you do. And my group chat with my friends, as silly as it sounds, like it is a source of refreshment, especially since, we're all over the world and we're in different time zones. So our group chats are like our only form of communication. And there is a tradition in my friend group. We have this project called Dope Ass Music Wednesday. And we started this when we had just graduated. We were working in studios and offices, and we would get like so bored and we were like running out of things to listen to. So every Wednesday, we would send each other new music, or like music that we were listening to. And it started with us just sending like links to songs, but like as time progressed, it turned into like us sending like full-on mixtapes. So like now we're like a little bit more busy, so we don't do it like every Wednesday, but during like a season of Dope Ass Music Wednesday, we'll like send each other like dope ass mixes of songs that we're listening to. And it's just like a friendly, creative expression amongst friends, which is like the best. So in that spirit, since it is Wednesday, I have created a mixtape for this artist talk, and I will be sharing it with everybody if you like, to take with you. This mixtape, when I was making it, I wanted to channel the same ideas as this talk and like sort of like design it to make work too, like for like long studio session. Yeah. It's a collection of songs that hopefully will get you into that creative zone so you can go back to being outside and like, yeah. So I hope you enjoy that. The name for this talk came from a conversation I had recently with a friend that, yeah. Wait, let me gather my thought on this. The name from this talks came from a talk. The name for this talk, anyway, I'm getting confused now. Basically, I've been spending a lot of time in Europe this summer and sourcing inspiration and research for my next short film. And I was having drinks with a friend in London, and we were like trying to figure out where to go next, like within Europe. And she asked me if I was on vacation or if I was on a field trip, like in regards to my work. And I really liked that sentiment, like the idea of going somewhere with the intent of learning and researching and having firsthand experience and being present. And I am, like I'm expanding my creative process, pulling inspiration from the world around me, doing research, being curious, slowly evolving, and trying to like make the best work that I can do. And that to me is everything. So yeah, thank you. That's it.
That was incredible. Thank you so much, David, for sharing, for being so vulnerable, for making a mixtape. Like, that's crazy. That's
I made
just,
a mixtape for everybody.
oh, this was like incredibly touching for me personally, but I want to open it up to the chat. If you guys have any questions, like, please feel free to unmute, ask David live, pop them in the chat, and I can read them out. Would love to keep this conversation going.
Should I stop sharing my screen? Like, what's the deal here?
Yeah, if you want to stop sharing your screen and we can
I'm like always so
gather
nervous something's gonna like pop up.
No, nothing popped up.
Okay, cool. My phone was vibrating throughout the entire thing. I'm so sorry. The group chat that I was
Oh
talking
my God,
about.
don't apologize. I love that they're like so supportive that you have them like in real time during the event. This is incredible.
Oh yes, in real time.
Okay, well, I'll kick it off with a question. Feel free to pop in the chat or unmute. You talked about revisiting a film. I thought that was a really interesting sentiment and that whole concept that nothing's ever done, because especially post, working on something that was done in school and then coming out of school, like that's like a big transition in terms of the approach, the guidance that you have on the ground, as well as like I feel like I was always think about things in a kind of a black or white, like finish it, otherwise you will never finish it too. And I know I have a personal work that myself, like I feel that pressure. So I would love to hear more on your perspective on that. I think it's a fantastic approach, but could you speak more on it?
Yeah. Yeah, kind of arrived at that idea like after I had graduated and I was applying for jobs and my school, RISD, one of its main critiques is that it doesn't really like prepare its students, or certainly it's like animation students for, like for the job industry. We don't really graduate with like a commercial portfolio. We graduate with like experimental films. So when I graduated, I kind of like spent that summer just like putting together that portfolio. And part of that, and then like in the making of that portfolio, half of it was just like going on like YouTube and like watching tutorials on like how to like, use certain softwares or to like, make certain things. And another part of that was like revisiting old student projects that I had done and sort of like remaking them in a more like commercial way. So that sort of like planted the idea that like, oh, like I can just like return to this at like any point. Like it's the idea that nothing's like, I do believe like in putting your pencil down and like, that's it and that's where it is, and like respecting like, a finalization of something, but also like you know, with like working digitally, those files can be opened at any time and you can get stuck right back into like, into making it and tweaking it. So yeah.
That's amazing. There's a question in the chat. I'll read it out for those who are watching in the replay. Do you still draw an importance on the question why?
Do I still draw an importance on the question why? Yes. I do. Why? Definitely who, what, where, when, why, and how. They're all at the top of the research headline.
Amazing. And then another question, follow up to that. Do you draw on the question why throughout the process or at the end?
Definitely more at the beginning. At the end, not so much, because the questions, the why has been answered through the process of making it. Like if I don't feel resolved with the project at the end, if that why is still lingering, then the project's not necessarily finished.
Mm.
So no, not at the end.
Another question that I had that popped up when you were talking about if I'm not and I'm gonna have to drop the full quote, but if you're not honest about yourself in the studio, then what are we doing here? What are some practices that you utilize to help you ensure that you're being honest with yourself, but not overly critical, especially keeping in mind, throwing out where you were at on your
Yeah.
film? How do you walk that fine line?
Yeah. Well, when I sit down, and it's when I'm working in my sketchbook and when I'm sitting and I'm animating, I am trying to create a very open and free dialogue with myself. And I'm like trying to be, it's like a way of like being present and a way of like communicating myself. And I'm like, it again, it's like it's very therapeutic. So how I'm able to get there, again, like in my sketchbook, I really like, I cannot share a lot of those pages. Like I am really just like throwing a lot of like private thoughts onto that page, because that's like how I'm like being able to get to these spaces. Like I'll write like a lot of poems, and I'm being very like melodramatic or like whatever. Like I'm really like any thought or any like feeling I'm trying to capture in the most honest way in my sketchbook. And then when I'm animating, I'm like processing, those ideas, and I'm like, trying to figure them out or work my way through them. When I started the film over, it was, again, it was me being honest with myself. And yeah, and I have to critique myself, because I'm like, I'm animating this film alone. I don't have a director and I don't have a team. I have my friends, but I don't have like a team of people that I can sort of turn to and be like, what do you think? Ultimately, it's my decision. Like, is it good enough for me? And it wasn't. It wasn't like bad animation. It just wasn't making any sense. It wasn't going anywhere. And I was like, I can spend, another 6 months working on this project and it's going to continue to go nowhere. Or I can like, start over now and hopefully, turn the ship around. And it was definitely the right decision, because then it only took me 4 months to redo it. 4 months of like extreme like pressure lockdown animating. Like it was also like during the year of 2020, so like there really wasn't anything to do but to be indoors. And I had just gotten this grant, so I was like, I have nothing but time and I have no excuse to not work on this film. So that was also a major factor.
Incredible. Thank you. Any questions people want to unmute for? Jump in.
Hi, this is Joey here. I'm sure I'm not the only one who feels this way, but I thought Compositions for Understanding Relationships was a very, very special work. Um, and I wanted to ask, because the film has so many different uh, references to other pieces of work, if you could describe what kind of goes on in your head or in your heart that makes you decide, oh, this moment or this movie or this video game I'm uh consuming or watching is taking on like a different quality.
Hmm.
Like, yeah, like specifically like what I think about the when I saw Zelda or like Link the Legend of Zelda game in your film, it took on a whole other quality. And I was like, and I'm wondering, what was it like in yourself that you saw something beyond what it was?
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate that. I sort of like touched on a little bit within the talk when I was animating the Zelda sequences. I wasn't sure like what like how it was going to like work, but spending more time with it and animating it, you know, I just started to just see the images in a different way, and it revealed itself to me, you know. I sort of like saw myself as like Zelda, like as like time traveling and like communicating with like my past self and my future self and like my present self. And um I lost my train of thought. Going back to and then seeing it in its full context also gave it like a new meaning. And there's something about that sequence that I think I'm not totally sure why it's as interesting or compelling as it is. Like a lot of like every time I have like not every time, but like most of the time people will, contact me or comment on the film, they always mention that sequence and they always talk about it, and everyone has a different reaction to it. And I think that's really, really interesting. And it's, again, it's like not really my job to like conduct or dictate, what that experience should be for everyone. But one of the things I like about making playlists or mixtape is that songs can be recontextualized by the syntax of like what comes before and after it. The meaning changes in its position. And that's kind of like how I was editing, this film, taking all these different images and footages of like video games and films and blending them together to recontextualize its meaning. The film itself is really just a collection of images that make me think about another person. So within that, that's how I operated, like collecting these images. It was a very like personal, meaningful development. And then putting them all together, recontextualizing them into a film. And then also through the process of animation, I use rotoscope as a way to kind of communicate how I'm viewing and experiencing an image. So yeah.
Thank you. That was a great answer.
Thank you.
Any
Yeah.
other questions?
How
Feel
are we all
free.
doing?
How are you doing? I know it's like 1 a.m. there.
I'm great. I think there's like still people at the bar across from this apartment, like drinking
God.
and smoking. So the city is alive.
There's an after party there waiting
Just
for you.
after party, yeah, at the bar across the street in Paris.
Amazing. No, I do want to take a moment just to like genuinely appreciate your vulnerability, sharing the pages of your sketchbook, but also bringing us into your creative process and like in such a like a very visceral way. It was deeply touching. I think everyone, I encourage you to read through the comments in the chat because there's some lovely ones here, but also it's always inspiring to come into contact or witness an artist or animator who's really paying attention to their surroundings and like the messages and the mediums in which they're being communicated, and just hearing even from a hike that you go on to talk about the Kardashians about being something that is like truly transformative is it's really phenomenal. And I think it's a good reminder to slow down and like just be and like be an acceptance to that. And it was like a lesson in honesty and truth that you brought tonight, and I'm incredibly grateful for it. And so many wonderful comments in the chat too. So thank you
Sure.
so much, David, for taking the time to share this with us. Truly inspiring.
Thank you. I'm like scrolling through some of the comments now since I missed out on that since when I was reading, when I was doing the talk. But thank you everyone for coming and supporting After Hours and yeah. So I hope it sort of gives you something to mull over. I'll send you a link to the mixtape, and then maybe you could like email it to everyone who like, I don't know,
Absolutely.
like subscribed or whatever.
Yeah, so I'll include it in the YouTube channel as well. But that's like
yes, but also like, I don't know, because it's like music like copyright or whatever. Like,
okay,
are you allowed to like distribute that? I don't
maybe
know.
not. Just the people
Maybe not
here.
on the YouTube. It'll be like, for the people who know, they know.
Exactly. Okay, incredible. I'm going to stop the recording, but truly thank you so much again. And thank you all for coming out tonight.
Thank you.